Salam. Peace be upon you. Episode 13 The Silent Ground, Part 4 Pre-ontological Status. Before exists. There is one primitive, phi, the holophase, a continuous cyclic order that makes reality readable. When phi becomes readable as change, its first differential phase appears, and with it, three inseparable readouts arrive together. The temporal dimension omega, omega, the spatial dimension kappa, kappa, and the kinematic dimension nu, nu, woven from the first two. Every higher derivative is a finer question about how phi changes, and each one casts these three shadows together. What we call worlds, objects, forces, histories, and minds are stable, licensed patterns inside this derivative language. The formal mathematical work behind these ideas can be found on Zenodo by searching Holophase. Let me remind you where we've come from. We didn't start from space. We didn't start from time. We didn't start from matter or energy. We started from what makes anything readable at all. We introduced phi as the primitive, not a thing in the world, but what makes a world legible. We reframed energy as tele, not substance. We built the discipline of licensing and coherence. And in episode 12, we installed the epistemic firewall, the immune system that stops our stories from running ahead of what can be checked. Now we're in episode 13, which unfolds in two movements. First, undifferentiated phi, phi before any readable change. Second, differentiated phi, phi once change becomes public and licensed. The first must come before the second because if we rush to differentiation, we'll smuggle in what we should be deriving. We'll assume space, time, matter, or energy as primitives rather than earning them from phi. Undifferentiated phi gives us the permission layer. What phi is, what it is not, and why you cannot build anything without earning comparability first. Differentiated phi gives us the public layer. How change becomes readable under licensing, how omega, kappa, and nu appear as readouts, how topology and tallies become lawful, how persistence and memory become possible, and how the firewall governs every claim. We are now focusing on part 4 inside this larger arc. And here is our firewall sentence: the discipline that keeps us honest. If you hear me smuggling space, time, energy, matter, or dynamics as primitives here, treat it as an error. Now let me tell you a story about what comes before existence. Imagine a child standing in a room, pointing at a shadow on the wall. Is that real? The child asks. This question seems simple, innocent. But let's look at what's really happening here. To ask, is that real? The child must already distinguish real from not real. The question itself assumes that reality and non-reality are different things, that they can be told apart, that the distinction between them matters. That distinction, that comparison, is already using phi, already using primitive comparability, already using the capacity to tell one thing from another. The question about existence presupposes the tools needed to ask the question. This is what we mean when we say phi is pre-ontological. It comes before the question, does it exist, becomes meaningful. Let me state this claim clearly. Phi is not something that exists. Phi is what makes exists meaningful. Let me say that again in even simpler words. Before you can ask whether something is real, you need the capacity to distinguish real from not real. That capacity is phi. So phi comes before existence itself. This might sound strange at first. It might feel backward. We're used to thinking that things exist first, and then we ask questions about them. But let's look more closely. Think about asking, Do I exist? Right now, as you listen to this, ask yourself that question. Do I exist? Notice what happens in your mind. The question separates I exist from I don't exist. It creates a distinction. It compares two possibilities. That act of distinguishing, that act of comparing, that's already using phi. The question about your own existence uses the very capacity that makes questions about existence possible. This is the deep insight of this part. Phi isn't a thing that exists in the usual sense. Phi is the condition that makes talk about existence coherent. Now, why does this matter so much? Because if we don't understand this, we'll make a fundamental mistake. We'll treat phi as another thing in reality. We'll ask, does phi exist? And think we're asking a meaningful question. But we're not. We're using the tools phi provides to ask about the provider of those tools. It's like using a light to look for the source of light itself. The light lets you see everything else, but you can't turn it around to see itself directly. If you hear me smuggling space, time, energy, matter, or dynamics as primitives here, treat it as an error. We're not talking about things in space-time yet. We're talking about what comes before the very framework in which things can be said to exist. Now let me give you one everyday analogy to make this concrete. Only one analogy. We'll explore it deeply and return to it, because stacking metaphors creates confusion rather than clarity. Imagine you're in the mountains, on a day when the fog is so thick you can't see anything. Can't tell mountain from sky. Can't tell rock from air. Can't tell near from far. Everything is uniform white. In that fog, someone asks you, is the mountain there? What does this question mean when you can't see anything? When you can't distinguish mountain from not mountain? When the very concept of mountain has no clear reference because everything looks the same? The question, is the mountain there, presupposes that you can distinguish mountain from not mountain. It assumes you have the capacity to tell the difference. Without that capacity, the question is empty. It's just words without meaning. Now imagine that the fog begins to clear, just a little, just enough that you start to see shapes. Start to see that this patch of gray might be rock, that patch might be sky. The capacity to distinguish emerges. And only then does the question, is the mountain there, become meaningful. Phi is like that emerging capacity to distinguish. Not the mountain, not the fog, not the clearing, but the coming into being of the ability to tell one thing from another. Before that capacity exists, questions about what exists don't make sense. They're like asking, is the mountain there, in perfect fog? After that capacity exists, questions about existence become possible. They become meaningful. But here's the crucial point. The capacity itself isn't another thing you can point to in the landscape. It's not a mountain or a rock or a patch of sky. It's what makes pointing to mountains and rocks and sky possible. This is what we mean by pre-ontological. Phi comes before the ontology, before the catalog of what exists, because it's what makes the catalog possible. Now, if this understanding is correct, if phi really is pre-ontological, really is what makes talk about existence meaningful, then we should be able to make some predictions. Here's the prediction. Any supposed ultimate foundation of reality that can be meaningfully questioned with, does it exist, isn't actually ultimate. It's sitting on something more basic, the comparability that makes the question coherent. Let me explain what this means. Whenever someone proposes a fundamental thing, a fundamental particle, a fundamental field, a fundamental substance, a fundamental consciousness, and we can meaningfully ask, does this exist? Then that thing isn't truly fundamental. Because the question itself uses distinction, uses comparability, uses phi. The truly fundamental thing would be something where the question, does it exist, doesn't make sense. Not because it's mysterious or beyond understanding, but because it's what makes the framework of existence talk possible in the first place. That's phi. So the prediction is this. Look at any claim about ultimate reality. If you can meaningfully question whether that thing exists, it's not actually ultimate. There's something more basic beneath it. And we see this everywhere in the history of thought. People proposed atoms as fundamental. Then we asked, do atoms exist? The question made sense. So atoms weren't truly fundamental. We found quarks. People proposed quarks as fundamental. Then we asked, do quarks exist? The question made sense. So quarks aren't truly fundamental either. Every time we propose something as fundamental, if the existence question applies, we eventually find something beneath it. Phi is different. With phi, the question, does it exist, uses the very capacity phi provides. It's self-referential in a way that shows phi is truly primitive. That's the prediction. And it holds across every domain of inquiry. Now, what would falsify this claim? What would prove me wrong? Here's the falsification condition. If someone can give you a complete account of reality where the most fundamental thing can be questioned as existing or not, without already using comparability, then this claim fails. Let me be concrete. If someone can build a complete, coherent system of understanding, a system that explains everything we see, everything we experience, everything we know, and within that system they can point to the most fundamental element and meaningfully ask, does this exist? Without that question itself presupposing the capacity to distinguish existence from non-existence, then phi is not pre-ontological. But notice what happens when someone tries to do this. Even saying it doesn't exist distinguishes existence from non-existence. Even questioning presupposes the framework for questioning. Even doubting uses the tools that make doubt coherent. The attempt to present a fundamental thing that can be questioned about existence always uses the very capacity that makes such questioning possible. This isn't war games, it's structural. It's about what must be in place for certain kinds of questions to be meaningful. But the falsification condition stands. If someone can do it, truly, genuinely present a fundamental element that can be questioned about existence without presupposing comparability, then this understanding fails. Now let me be clear about scope and limits. This claim applies to any framework where existence questions make sense. Any system where does it exist is a meaningful thing to ask. It doesn't apply to states where existence questions don't arise, where the very framework of existence and non-existence doesn't apply. But here's something important. We're in that kind of state right now as we talk about phi. We're using language, which inherently deals with existence and non-existence, to talk about something that comes before that framework. This creates a tension, a necessary tension. We're using tools to talk about what makes the tools possible. We're standing on a ladder and trying to examine the ground the ladder stands on. This is why we need to be so careful, so disciplined. This is why the firewall matters. We're not saying phi is beyond understanding. We're saying phi is what makes understanding possible. And understanding what makes understanding possible requires a different kind of understanding, a meta-understanding, an understanding that includes awareness of its own conditions. That's what we're doing here. And let me remind you about energy, since it often comes up in these discussions. If we mention energy in this context, it must be as tele, not substance. Energy isn't a primitive fluid that exists. Energy is a count of activity, a summary, a tele. And even that framework, the framework of counting, of activity, of summary, presupposes comparability, presupposes phi. Now let me return to our single analogy, the mountain in the fog, and deepen it. In the thick fog, before any capacity to distinguish, asking, is the mountain there, is empty. It's not that the answer is, we don't know. It's that the question itself has no clear meaning. What does mountain refer to when you can't distinguish anything? What does there mean when you have no sense of location or distance? As the fog clears slightly, as the capacity to distinguish emerges, the question gains meaning. But notice, the emerging capacity isn't itself another thing in the landscape. It's not something you can point to and say, there it is. It's the coming into being of pointing itself, of distinguishing itself. Phi is like that. It's not another thing in reality. It's what makes the framework of things in reality possible. This is why calling Phi pre-ontological is precise. Ontology is the study of what exists. Pre-ontology is what makes ontology possible. And this understanding has practical consequences, deep consequences. When we forget that Phi is pre-ontological, we make category errors. We treat Phi as another entity, another force, another field. We ask questions about it that don't apply to it. We try to measure it as if it were a thing to be measured. But measurement requires distinction, requires comparability, requires Phi. So trying to measure Phi is like trying to use a ruler to measure the concept of measurement itself. The ruler presupposes what it's trying to measure. This doesn't mean Phi is mysterious or beyond science. It means we need to approach it differently. We need to understand it through its consequences, through what it makes possible, through the structures that emerge from it. And that's exactly what we'll do in the coming parts. We'll explore those structures, those consequences, those emergences. But we need to be clear about what we're doing. We're not studying Phi directly. We're studying the readable faces of Phi, the differential structures, the license patterns. Phi itself, in its undifferentiated sense, is what makes all that possible. But we don't access it directly. We access what it enables. This is a subtle but crucial distinction. It's like understanding sight by studying what can be seen, rather than trying to look directly at the capacity to see. You can't look at looking itself, but you can understand looking by understanding vision, by understanding light, by understanding the eye and the brain. Similarly, we understand Phi by understanding what Phi makes possible, by understanding comparability, by understanding distinction, by understanding readability. And that's what we're doing right now. We're understanding Phi by understanding that it's pre-ontological, that it comes before existence questions, that it's what makes existence questions meaningful. This understanding protects us from fundamental errors, from treating Phi as something it's not, from asking questions about Phi that don't apply to Phi. Now let me connect this back to our larger journey. In part 3, we established that Phi is primitive comparability, the capacity for distinction, the first permission. Now we're establishing that this capacity is pre-ontological, that it comes before the framework of existence and non-existence. These two understandings go together. They're two sides of the same coin. Comparability gives us distinction. Pre-ontological status tells us where distinction sits in the order of things. Together, they give us a clear picture of Phi in its undifferentiated state. And this picture is essential for what comes next. Because soon we'll move to differentiated Phi, to change becoming readable, to omega, kappa, and nu emerging, to the universe beginning to speak. But if we don't understand that Phi is pre-ontological, we'll make a fatal error. We'll treat the emerging structures, time, space, motion, as if they're the foundation. We'll treat them as primitives. We'll smuggle them in. But they're not primitives. They're readouts. They're consequences. They're what happens when Phi becomes readable as change. Phi is the primitive. not time, not space, not motion. And phi is pre-ontological. So time, space, and motion emerge within an ontological framework that phi makes possible. This ordering matters. This sequence matters. If we get it backward, everything that follows will be backward. Now, you might be wondering, if phi is pre-ontological, what does that mean for us? For our understanding? For our search for truth? It means something profound. It means that our most fundamental questions, questions about existence, about reality, about what is, are already standing on a foundation, already using tools, already within a framework. And that framework itself has conditions, has requirements, has a structure. Phi is that structure. So when we ask what exists, we're already within the house that phi built. We're already using the furniture that phi provided. This doesn't make our questions meaningless. It gives them context. It shows us their limits. It shows us their conditions of possibility. And that's valuable, deeply valuable. Because knowing the limits of our questions is part of knowing what our questions mean, part of knowing what answers to those questions can possibly mean. This is the discipline of Holophase science. Not just asking questions, but understanding what makes our questions possible. Not just seeking answers, but understanding the framework in which answers make sense. And this discipline protects us. It protects us from asking nonsense questions disguised as deep questions. It protects us from giving nonsense answers disguised as profound answers. It keeps us honest. Now, before we end, let me state the listener carry. One sentence to hold on to from this part. Phi isn't something that exists. Phi is what makes exists meaningful. Hold that understanding. Carry it with you. Because everything that follows, every structure, every pattern, every law, emerges within the framework that phi makes possible. Within the framework of existence and non-existence. Within the framework of is and is not. And knowing that framework has conditions, knowing that it rests on something deeper, changes how we understand everything within it. Now we're ready for the next step. Ready to explore what happens when this pre-ontological capacity becomes active. When comparability actually compares. When distinction actually distinguishes. That's where we're going next. But for now, sit with this understanding. Feel its depth. Feel its implications. Phi isn't in the catalog of what exists. Phi is what makes the catalog possible. That's part 4. That's pre-ontological status. Now we continue. Part essence. We established that phi is pre-ontological. It comes before the question, does it exist, becomes meaningful. Phi isn't something that exists in the usual sense. It's what makes existence talk coherent. The question about existence already uses distinction, already uses comparability, already uses phi. This understanding protects us from treating phi as another thing in reality, and shows that any fundamental element that can be meaningfully questioned about existence isn't truly fundamental. It's sitting on phi. Always peace be upon you.